In The New Yorker today reveals for the very first time what exactly motivated actor and director George Clooney to write his momentous op-ed calling on Biden to drop out of the presidential race, despite personally knowing him for more than 2 decades and Clooney's international fame as a movie star. Did not appear to recognize Clooney at that June 2024 fundraiser that Clooney was headlining, even after a Biden aide told the president, quote, "You know George Clooney." And it wasn't just Clooney who was alarmed, so was President Obama, so were other donors behind the scenes. Even Democratic Congresswoman Annie Kuster of New Hampshire, who saw the event on stage, which was not half as bad as what was going on backstage, came away thinking there was no way President Biden could serve another term. These brand new details coming just hours after more stunning revelations in an excerpt published by Axios that aides were privately discussing putting President Biden in a wheelchair for his second term because of his physical deterioration. Sources telling me and Alex Thompson that Biden's team thought it was, of course, politically untenable to have the president in a wheelchair during his reelection bid. They took steps to try to protect him in the images of his halting gait, including finding shorter walking paths, adding handrails to steps, using a smaller staircase to board Air Force One. Aides would also accompany Biden across the White House lawn to Marine One or from Marine One, not only to disguise what was going on, but in case he fell. President Biden's doctor, White House physician Kevin O'Connor, warned behind the scenes that if Biden had one more serious fall, he might need to be in a wheelchair for his recovery. Dr. O'Connor had long worried about the toll the job had taken on Biden's health and joked behind the scenes that Biden staff members were trying to kill him while he was trying to keep him alive. In response to our latest reporting, a spokesperson for Biden told Axios, quote, "Medical exams made clear that Biden had a stiffened gait caused in part by wear and tear to the spine, but that no special treatment was necessary and that it had not worsened. He was transparent about this, and it was far from severe. Yes, there were physical changes as he got older, but evidence of aging is not evidence of mental incapacity. And so far, we are still waiting for anyone, to point out where Joe Biden had to make a presidential decision or make a presidential address where he was unable to do his job because of mental decline. In fact, the evidence points to the opposite. He was a very effective president," unquote. On that question of did it ever rear its head and affect a decision or his ability to do the job, to that all I can say is stay tuned. But here now more of our exclusive reporting about what was going on behind the scenes in the final weeks before President Biden bowed out of the 2024 presidential race. It was an earth-shattering political moment.
President Joe Biden has just announced that he is dropping out of the 2024 presidential race.
Ignited by President Biden's disastrous CNN debate performance.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
And according to excerpts first reported in The New Yorker magazine from the new book, Original Sin, I wrote with Axios' Alex Thompson, before his op-ed calling on the president to resign shocked the world, one of Hollywood's biggest stars was privately alarmed about the president's fitness. This was weeks before the debate.
It was a civic duty because I found that when I saw people on my side of the street not telling the truth, I thought that was time to...
Are people still mad at you for that?
Some people, sure. It's okay.
The book is based on more than 200 interviews, mostly with Democratic insiders, almost all of which occurred after the 2024 election was over, and has new behind-the-scenes revelations from the star-studded Hollywood fundraiser, and jarring details about what Clooney, a staunch Biden ally and longtime friend, saw of the president's condition. Backstage at the fundraiser, quote, Biden hobbled out from around the corner. Clooney knew the president had just arrived from the G7 Leaders Summit in Apulia, Italy that morning and might be tired, but holy shit, he wasn't expecting this. The president appeared severely diminished, as if he'd aged a decade since Clooney last saw him in December 2022. He was taking tiny steps and had an aide guiding him by his arm. Others at the fundraiser were also horrified. Quote, "It was like watching someone who was not alive," a Hollywood VIP recalled. "It was startling, and we all looked at each other. It was so awful." In fact, it seemed President Biden did not recognize Clooney, one of the most famous people in the world, someone he had known for decades. Quote, Biden looked at him. "Thank you for being here," he said. "Thank you for being here." "You know, George," the assisting aide told the president, gently reminding him who was in front of him. It was obvious to most everyone standing there that the president did not know who George Clooney was. Attendees at the fundraiser were flabbergasted. It was not okay, recalled the Hollywood VIP who had witnessed this moment. That thing, the moment where you recognize someone you know, especially a famous person who's doing an effing fundraiser for you, it was delayed. It was uncomfortable. George Clooney? The aide clarified for the president. Oh, yeah, Biden said. Hi, George. And weeks later, after the monumental debate, when Clooney wrote about what he witnessed, it sent shockwaves throughout the political world. Quote, "We got so screwed by Biden as a party," David Plouffe, who helped run the Harris campaign, told us, by deciding to run for re-election and then waiting more than 3 weeks after the debate to bow out, Plouffe added, quote, "He totally effed us." He didn't actually use the word effed. As you saw, I spoke with George Clooney recently about his new play, Good Night and Good Luck, which is set entirely in 1954 until the very end, where there's a montage of news clips, including misleading statements from Republicans about the 2020 election and misleading statements from Democrats about Biden's acuity. And Clooney told me that those clips from Democrats were important for him to include alongside the Republican lies. He said it's important for journalists and others to speak truth to power no matter which party you support, and to remind people, in Clooney's words, quote, "That's how Trump won." Let's bring in CNN's team of reporters who extensively covered President Biden, CNN's Phil Mattingly, Arlette Saenz, and MJ Lee. Phil, let's start with you. Put this into perspective, why this matters about President Biden's acuity. No one, by the way, is alleging that this is how he is 24/7. Obviously, he's capable of having a conversation. The issue is that there were increasing number of situations like this where he couldn't recall names or events, where he had difficulty with his train of thought.
And it was the increasing number, I think, that we've learned mostly after the fact, and as you're reporting now, that was what was viewed as most problematic. When you think about somebody who was running to run the country for an additional 4 years, this wasn't something for next month, this wasn't something for 6 months from now, this was to run the country for the next 4 years. And I think the difficulty, one, just candidly in covering it, but I think also for a lot of Democrats outside the very tight-knit and very small inner circle, was the ability to actually see it and experience it on a regular basis, because there weren't a lot of face-to-face interactions or close interactions in that regard, which made it so critical for those who were so close around him to share what was actually happening to the extent they were concerned about it. I think the question was, how concerned was the inner circle really, given how protective they were, and I think importantly, and I think you guys point this out, how deeply they believed in him, his ability to come back after so many times when it seemed like he was down for the count.
So Arlette, here's another excerpt from the New Yorker about the fundraiser. Quote, "Clooney was certainly not the only one concerned. Other high-dollar attendees who posed for photographs with Obama and Biden described Biden as slow and almost catatonic. Though they saw pockets of clarity while watching him on television on stage later that night, there were obvious brain freezes and clear signs of a mental slide. It was, to some of them, terrifying." One of the things that's remarkable about this, though, is so many of them refused to share any of this until after the election, because they were convinced, okay, but the alternative's Trump, and that justifies everything.
Yeah, and that really drove a lot of President Biden's reason for seeking re-election, that he thought that he was the only one who he beat Trump back in 2020 and could do it again in 2024. But he was surrounded by a very close-knit group of advisors that itself had also drawn a lot of criticism in the past, that they hadn't let in new voices. And these advisors had really worked very carefully to manage the stagecraft of his presidency, going back to, as you talked about, the walks to Marine One, using that smaller set of stairs on Air Force One. I think back to the foreign trips, when they said that he would not attend the dinners that would typically be held with foreign leaders. All of this was a lot of efforts to manage Biden's schedule, especially as he increased in age and started to show some signs of that physical deterioration.
So there's behind the scenes the stuff that Clooney and others saw, where he was just shockingly awful. Then he went on stage at that event and was just like vaguely awful, not as shockingly so, but certainly every day of his 81 years. At the end of the fundraiser, he walks to the edge of the stage. He stares kind of blankly at the crowd. President Biden turns back. He grabs Biden's arm, guides him off stage. Obama later explained that, like, no, he wasn't. Obama just wanted to get the hell out of there. I mean, he couldn't do it until Biden got out there too. But here's an excerpt about it. He doesn't look like he knows where he's supposed to go, thought Congresswoman Annie Kuster, that's a Democrat from New Hampshire, sitting in the audience with the California Congresswoman Julia Brownley. They'd seen him in the photo line, and Kuster could tell it was a struggle for the president to engage.
Former President Joe Biden's apparent inability to recognize George Clooney at a June 2024 fundraiser is one of the starkest revelations from CNN's Jake Tapper and Axios' Alex Thompson's new reporting for their upcoming book, Original Sin. They report that days before that debate, the infamous debate on CNN between Biden and Trump, an aide had to gently remind the then president and presidential candidate who George Clooney was, saying, "You know George." The reporting goes on to detail the president's mental and physical decline months before the presidential election, including concerns from people close to him who thought he may need to use a wheelchair when it came to his physical capability for his second term. Tonight, the highest-ranking Democrat in Washington, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, said this in response.
Did you really not have any idea that he was not fit to serve a second term?
Casey, we're looking forward. We have the largest Medicaid cut in front of us. We have the whole federal
you're
government
facing all
at
of this
risk.
because you lost a presidential election. And
Well,
is that not Joe Biden's responsibility for deciding to run again?
We're looking forward.
That's it?
That's it.
Yet another excerpt from Original Sin suggests that Schumer had his own concerns ahead of the confrontation with Trump at CNN's debate. At a wedding that was held the same night as that Clooney fundraiser, a guest at Schumer's table recalled to him saying, and I'm quoting from Jake and Alex's book now, "If things go south at the debate, me, Barack, Nancy, and Hakeem have a plan B." Though Schumer later denied saying that. My sources tonight are former Biden White House Communications Director Kate Bedingfield and the former Communications Director for the Democratic National Committee, Sochi Inosa, and it's great to have both of you here. Kate, what's your response to reading this, given you worked up and close with President Biden inside the White House?
Well, is reported in these excerpts from the book. Everybody saw this in the summer of 2024 on that debate stage. And sorry, you having trouble with my audio?
Just a little bit. Just stand by. We're gonna fix your audio real quick. Sochi, let me get your view here, because obviously you worked at the Justice Department. You were there when Robert Hur's report dropped. The main takeaway from that was not even really about classified documents. It was about the president's age. When you hear this, how does this make you feel about your colleagues inside the White House?
Well, at the time, and you're right, Caitlin, at the time when we released the Robert Hur report, the Justice Department faced a lot of criticism that Attorney General Garland should have somehow redacted the report, should have not sent it to Congress, should have edited it, should have somehow intervened, which would have never happened and actually would have had to have been reported to Congress if that would have been the case. And Merrick Garland said that he wanted an independent Justice Department and promised to Biden that he would have an independent Justice Department. As you'll recall, Robert Hur put in his report as part of the reason why he wasn't moving forward with a prosecution of Joe Biden after he's president, because you cannot prosecute a sitting president. But once he leaves office, one of the reasons why he wasn't going to bring charges is because he said that if presented to a jury, once Joe Biden leaves office in his mid to late 80s, that he would be seen to a jury as a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. The White House slammed the Justice Department at the time, calling it gratuitous and saying that that was not appropriate for a prosecutor to do, that Robert Hur was a Republican. Mind you, I want to note that Robert Hur is now representing Harvard against the Trump administration. He is not someone who is political in any way, has worked under Democratic and Republican administrations. But the reality is that became the topic for many, many weeks coming from the White House and from Biden's allies. And so to hear the reporting is really, frankly, shocking, but also at the same time just goes back to Robert Hur was not trying to insinuate in any way or say, and he never said that Biden was fit or wasn't fit to be president. What he was making a determination on is how a jury were to react later down the line, which also seems like a concern to the White House based on Jake Tapper's book.
Yeah, and Kate, when you look at this, I mean, there's another part of this in terms of the president's physical ability to just get around. You know, we had heard the White House insist a lot that the president was fine. The new book says that the president's aides actually privately talked about putting him in a wheelchair for part of his second term after the election. Now, there is obviously nothing wrong with being in a wheelchair. Many capable people are in wheelchairs and do their jobs just fine. But it did come as the White House was insisting publicly, there's nothing wrong here. He just has a stiff gait. As someone who worked there, how do you see this in terms of responsibility or what the public knew versus what people around the president thought?
Look, I worked there until March of 2023. In my experience with President Biden, he was certainly able to get around. He was riding his bike in Rehoboth Beach, but I also March 1st of 2023, and that's not the time period that Jake and Alex's reporting covers. I will say that whether the question of whether somebody physically has to be in a wheelchair does not go to this question of mental acuity, for one thing. So the suggestion that somehow those two are related, I mean, the world saw that he was old and that his gait was getting stiffer. That was on display for everyone to see. That in and of itself does not raise a question about mental acuity. So I think it's important to acknowledge the difference between those two things. But the other thing I would say just more broadly about the question of a cover-up is, don't forget, it was the team around President Biden who advocated for the early debate and put him on the debate stage early in the campaign, thinking that it would be a favorable comparison for him. So I think the idea that there was, some sort of conspiracy to cover this up is belied by the fact that they chose to put him on the national stage and have that moment that ultimately became the undoing of the campaign. And that was because they thought it was, obviously, in retrospect, politically, I think a lot of different choices should have been made, no doubt. But this idea that there was an intentional cover-up, that certainly doesn't comport with what I saw when I was in the White House. And I think the fact that they put him out on that stage undermines that a little bit.
Well, and we heard Senator Schumer telling Kasie Hunt, it's time to move forward and look ahead. But to her point, Democrats are still reeling from losing the election. And Sochi David Plouffe, who was a top Obama campaign aide who helped run Harris's campaign after the president did get out of the race, he was quoted in the book. He says, "We got so screwed by Biden as a party. It's all Biden. He totally effed us." I mean, that is quite a quote to say about the Democratic president who just left office a few months ago.
Yeah, that's right. I worked at the DNC when Joe Biden was elected, and and I helped get him elected the first time. And what I'll say about that is that he won, and he actually benefited from having a very competitive primary. And so I think that Democrats often do well whenever you are able to debate the issues, when you are able to have a 10-person double-digit primary. Yes, no one wants to go through that, but at the end of the day, the voters want it. And so I do think Democrats looking back, whether Chuck Schumer wants to admit it or not, looking back, I think, yes, should we have had a primary? Yes. Should he have been a bridge candidate and a bridge president and embrace the next generation of leaders like Vice President Harris and other people? Absolutely. I think everyone looking back believes that we should have, and that he should have gotten out of the race and allowed that process to happen, and we would have had a stronger Democratic Party. And so I think the realization across the Democratic Party after losing the election is that one. Whether people like to admit it or not is another thing.
New tonight, a bombshell new book claiming that then President Biden did not recognize George Clooney at a fundraiser that the Oscar-winning actor was hosting for Biden, someone with whom he has spent time with and his friends. Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson write in their book, Original Sin, about a moment backstage. And they write in part, I quote, "Biden looked at him. Thank you for being here," he said. "Thank you for being here." "You know George," the assisting aide told the president, gently reminding him who was in front of him. Yeah, the president said. They continue to write. It was obvious to many standing there that the president did not know who George Clooney was. Well, a Hollywood VIP who witnessed this exchange between Biden and Clooney also tells the authors in part, quote, "It was not okay. That thing, the moment where you recognize someone you know, especially a famous person who's doing an effing fundraiser for you, it was delayed. It was uncomfortable. That description sort of, I think, bringing it home in a way that all of us could possibly imagine what happened there. Lulu Garcia-Navarro of the New York Times is here, along with journalist Gretchen Carlson, also the co-founder of Lift Our Voices. Okay, thanks so much to both of you. So, Lulu, when you read this, we had heard back when this fundraiser happened that maybe there was this recognizing awkwardness between Clooney and Biden. But all of this really puts the meat on the bones, the detail, the description, what the aide said. It is disturbing.
It's disturbing. This is really bad news for Democrats. Democrats want nothing more than to turn the page on the Biden era and focus on the Trump era. This allows them to be in the opposition. This allows them to point at the failings that they perceive of Trump. But, they cannot escape the fact that Joe Biden clearly was incapacitated. The question is, what did they know? How much did they know? And were they hiding it from the American people? Because when that debate happened, which we all saw,
right,
they tried to say, don't trust your lying eyes. He's got a cold, he's this, he's that. The fact was, as we're now learning, he was clearly not in his full faculties.
And I know that you have, a story to tell here.
Well, in March of 2022, I was with President Biden when he signed my first bill into law. And I spent a considerable amount of time with him behind the scenes and then in public with my family, with other survivors, with many other people. I noticed nothing other than an elderly man. I mean, but he was very jovial. He was carrying on all conversations. There was never any halting in his speech. So the fall of the mental capability must have been precipitous after that, if that was March 2022.
March 2022. I'm thinking back to when I interviewed him. That was 2024, June of 2024. Okay, I'm sorry, my brain is. He was elderly. He was, his voice was so soft, but he made a lot of news. He was in control of what he was doing. It seems, Lulu, that there were times of day and there were days when things were maybe different. And I guess that seems to be what they're sort of, hiding behind now and saying, well, he was fine enough of the time.
I mean, we don't know, right? Because he was never, part of what has been revealed is that they never really did a cognitive exam because they didn't want to, according to this reporting, which, I can't verify, but that's what they, said, is that they couldn't, they wouldn't be able to deny it if he was, if they actually had an exam. So we don't really know. But at the end of the day, we all saw that he wasn't, there some of the time. Now, the big question is he going to be there in the middle of the night if someone calls and there's an emergency? This is the President of the United States. This isn't your elderly grandfather.
That is the big question. And I think that, the big question around this is that Fox, outlets like Fox News were saying for a long time before this that he didn't have his mental capabilities. And ironically, it ended up being true. But I think, at the time, the idea that he was of sound mind, and then he suddenly wasn't, I think that plays into the whole fake news narrative, because now Republicans and people over at Fox News can say he was like that all the time. And I think it's a very important point also to bring up, that I believe his aides and the people around him thought that only Biden can beat Trump. He beat him the first time, and somehow we have to prop him up, because in their minds, they thought he was the only one capable of beating Trump. I think that was the narrative that they were living by.
And, Lulu, David Plouffe was a former top Obama campaign aide. He helped run Kamala Harris's campaign after Biden dropped out. He told authors that Biden's decision to run for re-election and then wait till 3 weeks after the debate, when he really fought to not get out, he said in part, we got so screwed by Biden as a party, he totally effed us.
Well, this is Washington's favorite game, which is who's to blame. And I think at this point, they got Biden out of the picture, and then they said he was a hero, he was wonderful, and now they're saying that they were effed. I think there's a lot of blame in the Democratic Party to go around. I have asked Speaker Nancy Pelosi point blank what she knew and when she knew it. I have asked Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, if there was a cover-up. Right after this happened, I asked a member of his cabinet if he knew.
Have any of them given
and
you
this is
an
the
answer
second,
of
Pete,
any
and
sort
Pete
of...
Buttigieg, and none of them said they knew anything. And so the issue here is, if they didn't know, why not? and what exactly happened
But
here.
this is why so many people don't want to align themselves with either party right now. It's why 43% of the general public consider themselves to be independents, because they cannot stand this sort of cover up or making things up and not telling the truth. They want transparency. I mean, it's part of the reason why Trump won this election. Not necessarily because if you agree with his policies or not, but because he puts himself out there and that's who he is, right? And that's what they want to see more, not necessarily like Trump, but they want to see more truth and honesty in politics.
But the biggest, listen, at the end of the day, the biggest thing that Joe Biden did was that he was never able to make a case for himself because of his age, because of possible infirmities. I don't know. But he was never able to say to the American people, these are my policies and I'm going to sell them. If you see Donald Trump, he's out there every day, every minute of the day, making a case for himself. Joe Biden hid from the press most of the time.
And this is why he should not be out on a PR tour right now. I think that he should be focusing on his legacy during the first couple of years when he was president and build his library and not go out there. He's only going to make the case worse.
So do you recognize the man on the far left in this photo? Maybe zoom in on him. You probably don't have to know him personally to answer that question as we zoom in on the man next to President Biden. That's obviously George Clooney, one of the most famous and recognizable actors of our time. But former President Joe Biden, who's known Clooney for at least 15 years, did not recognize George Clooney at the event where this photo was taken, the fundraiser that Clooney himself was co-hosting for Biden's campaign, raising a record-setting $30 million. This was just 2 weeks before Biden's disastrous debate, June 27th, 2024. The story all laid out in a brand new excerpt published today in the New Yorker magazine from my upcoming book with Axios' Alex Thompson. The book is called Original Sin. It's due out next Tuesday, 1 week from today. The book, based on more than 200 interviews, mostly with Democratic insiders. Almost all of the interviews occurred after the 2024 election was over. Clooney's fears from the fundraiser were confirmed when he watched Biden debate. Our book says, quote, "This was too much for Clooney. He reached out to Obama to tell him that he was considering writing an op-ed to call for Biden to drop out. Obama advised that doing so would only make Biden dig in deeper," unquote. Here to discuss, David Axelrod, former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. David, you haven't gotten a copy of the book yet, and none of the excerpts about you have come out yet, but you're in this book quite a bit as well, because you were one of the early Democratic voices out there saying President Biden should really think about whether or not he runs for re-election. And of course, the anvil dropped from the Biden White House landed on you not long after. Do you think at that point, President Obama was, well, what do you think was going through his mind? You know Obama well. He said to Clooney something along the lines of, if you write this op-ed, he's just going to dig in more. The relationship between Obama and Biden is so complicated. Give us your diagnosis on this all.
Look, they were at once friends, and they were also, politicians in their own right who were both presidents and with their own personality quirks. And, so there was a sense of deep friendship, but also, at least on the part of Biden, I think also some sense of rivalry to compete with the reputation and the achievements of Obama. But I will tell you that I think when Obama gave him advice, and I'm not going to tell you what that advice was, but he gave the advice that a good and loving friend should give. And I think one of the tragedies of this story is that Joe Biden served this country honorably for more than half a century, did accomplish some very significant things as president, but mistakenly thought that he was equipped to run for another term when as I said back in 2022, he'd be closer to 90 than 80 at the end of that term. And that was just not sensible. And a lot of people around him did not serve him well because they reinforced his desire to run instead of protecting his legacy and him. And by the way, also the Democratic Party and the country.
Yeah. One of the things, there's obviously pushback coming from the Biden camp about the book. And I don't blame them. It has some really ugly stories from Democratic insiders. But one of the things that is so obvious is the fact that they still, the family and these top aides, Mike Donnell and Steve Fischetti especially, they still obviously can't see what the rest of us see, because why would they think putting Biden and Jill Biden out on The View last week would somehow disprove the thesis of our book? It only proved it.
Well, not only that, you know, if you consider the politics of this moment, the only person who's talking about Joe Biden every day is Donald Trump. And he likes to set up this straw man, invidious comparison between a president who's no longer there and himself, because he thinks he benefits from that. And so injecting himself back into this is not only a disservice to himself, because he's not disproving your thesis, but it's also a disservice to the Democratic Party and the country. A country that wants to look forward, not back. So I think I think the same people who gave him bad advice before may be giving him bad advice now.
Another excerpt from the book that's in the New Yorker today about Biden's decision to stay in the race. Quote, "It was an abomination," one prominent Democratic strategist who publicly defended Biden told us. Quote, "He stole an election from the Democratic Party. He stole it from the American people," unquote. One of the things that's interesting about that quote is that Democratic strategist has only said things positive about Joe Biden publicly, but that's how the person feels privately. And there are a lot of Democrats like that.
Yeah, and I heard from a lot of them when I spoke out first in 2022 and then in 2023, some saying, "Gee, I'm glad you're saying what you're saying." Others saying, "You know, what are you doing? This is treacherous. You shouldn't be saying these things. He's the only guy who can win, or he's going to run and we can't stop him, and we don't want an ugly primary." I heard from a lot of them, Jake, in the first 3 minutes of that debate that you moderated, that tragic debate with President Trump, that shocking and stunning debate. People who were writing say, "Well, what do we do now?"
Right.
And so, I am, it doesn't, I'm not impressed by people, especially in unnamed quotes, who are willing to speak out now. The time to have said something was, years ago, because it was not. The presidency of the United States is the toughest job on the planet. I sat next to a president for 2 years. I watched a young man age before my eyes under the pressures of the presidency, and he was in a time of life when he could withstand that. But the idea that you can, at this age, handle those pressures, and what that New Yorker segment of your book reflects is the president had been he'd been in Europe, and he had at the, I guess, NATO meetings, and he had been traveling, and he was spent and he was exhausted. And, and people offered that as an excuse, but no, the presidency doesn't allow for that. You have to be relentless, and you have to deal and power through all of that. And you cannot do that when you're in your 80s. And certainly he couldn't. And by the way, I think there is, I know Donald Trump feels like he's indestructible. He's a very energetic guy, but it's worrisome because this age thing, it plays tricks on you, and it catches up with you very, very quickly. And under the pressures of this job, more quickly.
David, keep your schedule open next week, because the book drops in 1 week from today, and I want to have you back to talk about it, especially the parts involving you. David Axelrod, thanks so much.